looks like we are live. I will give this just a moment to let people go ahead and file in. We're joined by a very exciting guest today, Mark Vernon. We're going to be talking about Owen Barfield and Dante. Now, this is a really exciting topic for me personally because I'm obviously a big fan of Dante, but know very little about Owen Barfield's writing on the man and his work. And so this will be a wonderful topic. Mark is an author who I believe you have a book coming out on William Blake. Is that correct?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much for inviting me on to talk about these wonderful people and works. But yeah, my latest book is about William Blake. Coming out in the US in the beginning of September. It's out in the UK already where I live. But it's called
Excellent.
Awake. Yeah, but it draws on Barfieldian ideas. Actually, I think there's actually a lot of resonance between Barfield and Blake. In fact.
I would imagine so, and I've seen that in your work. You've obviously detailed this with some other books in the past. So just before we dive into this, do you mind giving listeners a little bit of an idea of your background and how you came to get into the topics of William Blake, Dante, Barfield, etc.? I'd love to hear that.
Yeah, thank you. I tell you what, just one very practical thing. I can't see you, I can hear you, but I guess that's all right. It looks good your end, as it were, before I launch out to make sure this is coming across okay.
Yes, so I am seeing things. If you give me one moment, I'll just go ahead and confirm that we are having that people are able to see. If you're able to write a message, by the way, go ahead and just let us know that you, the viewers, are able to see everything. Let me ask this question real fast on my computer up here. I suppose, all right, we're hearing that we're able to see, so we can go
Okay.
ahead then. Yeah. So go ahead. Tell us a little bit about your info. Would love to, or your background, I should say. Would love to understand this.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I work as a psychotherapist about half my time, so a keen interest in inner life. And I've also worked as a Christian priest in the Church of England. I left that quite a few years ago now, sort of 25 or more years ago. But this sense of how our inner life relates to a wider sense of inner life, whether that's imagined in relation to God or in some other way. And so these figures like Barfield and like Dante, and indeed latterly like William Blake, I think they were onto this too. And so they provide these wonderful cultural resources to help us expand our imagination in that direction. I actually came at it, first of all, via Plato. I did a PhD on Plato and discovered Barfield because whilst I did this PhD and, got it, I felt I hadn't really got to grips with what Plato was saying. And then I read Barfield, and Barfield says people can write whole books about Plato and read everything he wrote and still not have understood what Plato's driving at, because our assumptions about the way the world is, our thoughts and perceptions are so dramatically different. So you can read the same word in Plato, a word like theory, for example, but the word carries completely different resonance for us now. So this set me off on a real journey about how across periods of what you might call cultural time, so, maybe 500 years or so, so reaching back to Plato 2,500 years, there's continuity, but there's also difference. And so trying to understand that is absolutely fundamental when approaching these writers, these texts, that are more than, say, 300 or 400 years old.
Indeed. Well, I can certainly imagine that the interplay of all that between what you're doing with, you said psychotherapy, is that it?
Yeah, exactly.
Indeed, with psychotherapy mixing with these ideas and trying to understand, what do these have to say in the present? And the point on language, I think, is really interesting too, because the little that I do know about Barfield, I know that he talks a little bit, and correct me if I'm wrong, about language as a portal to revealing what's true and what's real, and not just hiding it, which a lot of people, talk about language today as doing that, as hiding reality, but in fact is revealing it. So how have you seen that play out in your work? And then we could, properly dive into this with Dante, but I'm just curious as to that point as well.
Well, it begins actually just with an everyday observation, which is that words are immensely meaningful. And they're not meaningful just in the sense that they're like a mode of data exchange, but a word can move you. You know, in the therapy context, the right word, and you spend a lot of the time in a way trying to find the right words, can really help shift things for someone. So Barfield says that words have soul. They have a kind of vitality that the poet knows, that the writer knows, that people that use words for their living also know and become attuned to. And that word of the soul can also then speak to our souls. And so that's why language and so on has this extraordinary capacity, not just to serve as a kind of information exchange, but to take us to different realms, to make us shift, even sometimes quite profoundly inside, to help us with others enter different worlds, different zones, whether that be in the past or place, you know, whether it's a personal memory or in the works of a great writer, a kind of cultural memory. And so this vitality of words, this inside life of words, also made Barfield feel that language is not as is commonly described, particularly through Darwinian evolutionary explanations, as a kind of system of signs that began in a primitive way and gradually got more and more sophisticated. He thinks that doesn't really add up. And in fact, even in mainstream evolutionary science, how language emerged is a major problem still. You know, various theories, but highly contested. And Blake argues it's because we've forgotten that language has an inside life all of its own, which we collaborate with, we borrow with. You know, when you speak, you try and reach for the right word. And it's like there's a whole field of possibility out there. And, you know, the good speaker, the good writer can get the right word that makes that whole field come alive for you. And so he felt actually that when language first appears, it's nature speaking through us. And that's why when a writer now gets their words right, it feels timeless. It feels like it's communicating. It's a portal. You know, you read the work and it's a threshold through which much is coming. So he has this very radical, holistic view of language, which is very different from the more common referential view of language as it's normally described.
Well, thank you for that. I find that incredibly fascinating, and I would certainly love to come back to it. Just one point I wanted to pick up on, though, was the description of reaching for words, or we could even say grasping. Even that, in that example, there is this certain element of what you say and what you don't say. For example, you don't farm for words, you grasp for them. And so this all seems to come out as something organic. And so I think we'll get back to more of that with Barfield's thoughts on Dante. But let's go ahead and just give a little bit of a bird's eye view on what Barfield, how he got into Dante, or what his main theses with Dante are. You know, what does he have to contribute to this area of scholarship? Why is he worth paying attention to when it comes to his thoughts on Dante?
Barfield's relationship with Dante is very much in the context of his relationship with this group of Oxford linguists, philologists, writers, known as the Inklings. And the most famous members of those are Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, but also Charles Williams. And Barfield was part of that group. And C.S. Lewis called him his second friend. And Lewis felt you need to have a first friend who's someone you disagree with. But then you need a second friend who you trust completely, but whom you're always teasing things out, even in an argumentative way. And one of the things which Barfield and Lewis much debated was Dante. So Lewis, apart from everything else that he was a professor of medieval literature at Oxford, you know, probably the leading English-speaking scholar of medieval literature at the time. So read Dante and the Divine Comedy in particular repeatedly. He and Barfield would go on summer holidays where they would read the Divine Comedy once more in the Italian and discuss it again. Lewis makes very brilliant observations about the Divine Comedy in a number of ways. And so Barfield is drawn into the Divine Comedy as well, I think largely through his relationship with Lewis and also Charles Williams. Charles Williams also made a big contribution to modern Dante scholarship. But what I think Barfield loved about the Divine Comedy was that it shows people in different states of consciousness. So their perceptions of the way reality actually is dramatically different across particularly the three different canticles of hell, purgatory, and then paradise. So for Barfield, it's not just that the Divine Comedy purportedly describes states of being after death, but that it describes states of awareness even now, this kind of hellish, trapped state of mind, a purgatorial, transformative state of mind, and then a paradisal, abundant state of mind, if you like. But Barfield was really drawn to that because he thought that as our consciousness shifts over periods of time, so our capacity to receive or perceive these different kinds of contact with reality shifts as well. So the Divine Comedy, in a way, was a rich resource, alive material for him to think with in terms of his relationship of his understanding of language and its relationship to our awareness.
That's fascinating, and I'd love to pick up on precisely that about the evolution of consciousness. Now, what are some of the ways in which our collective consciousness has changed since the time of Dante? And when Barfield talks about something and uses the word evolution, is he talking about simply a change in a differing, or is he actually talking about an evolution in terms of consecutively getting better?
So just on your last point there, it's not getting better. People's 3,000 years ago, they had clearly immensely rich, sophisticated ways of engaging with life, with the gods, with the world. But it's just very different from ours. And so it seems quite alien and strange to us. And what happens is in different epochs, if you like, different facets of reality emerge. So, to make an obvious example of that, we live in an age that feels very, very conscious of the material aspects of reality to the extent that many people would doubt there's a spiritual. And we live in a world that's deeply shaped by technology, for example, which is the use and manipulation of the material aspects of reality. So we're thoroughly embedded in that. But what Dante, I think, realized in his time, so we're talking sort of 14th century, is that the old medieval dispensation was changing fast. And he writes the Divine Comedy, I think, and he's only because he says it himself, not as it were, as if he's trying to produce the glorious summit of the medieval mind, but because he realizes that the medieval mind is shifting. And it's shifting partly because of material conditions. The old feudalism has long gone, and there's a new economic reality that people are struggling with. And that affects the way that they live their lives. There's the earliest forms of mercantilism that become capitalism. So people's habits, their practices, their desires, their mode of living is rapidly changing. But also Dante lives in the 100 or so years after the birth of what we now call nominalism, which is the philosophical movement that starts to doubt that when, for example, I have a thought or you have a thought, we're taking part in a kind of great flow of thinking that's not ours to possess, but is ours to join in with. And nominalism says, no, the thoughts in your head, the thoughts in my head are our own. They somehow emerge from within us as much more autonomous kind of individuals. And so there's a beginnings of a great uncoupling from the wider world that's taking place. And, now is almost the default assumption in terms, certainly in the West, in terms of how we experience ourselves as, autonomous individuals. And so Dante's onto this. And I think he realizes implicitly, at least, that there's a kind of upside and a downside to this. The downside is the sense of alienation. Questions like what's the meaning of life and so on start to get asked. And this is played out in the characters of the Divine Comedy. But also, there's an upside to this, which is that an individual like Dante, who's not a priest, who's not writing in Latin, though he could, who, as it were, is an ordinary human being writing in the vernacular, that individuality has a freedom that wasn't possible to exercise maybe 200 or 300 years before. And so there's also the sense in which, even you and I now having this kind of conversation um, has become possible because of the sense of who we are, and particularly the importance of the individual now, even though what we might often talk about is how we regain a sense of wider participation, which was beginning to come undone in Dante's time.
So on that point, then, gaining this wider participation in a, at the very least, different kind of consciousness, what role does poetry play in that? What role does a work like the Divine Comedy play in that?
So Barfield, he writes a whole book, Poetic Diction, about how poetry works. And poetry is an entry point for him for this wider notion of the evolution of consciousness. Because what he argues the poet does is they put words together in such a way that the soul of the words is released afresh. And so that's the impact of the poem. That's why we feel, oh, I've had a shift of perception in reading those words. An example he gives is a difference between, say, using the phrase old prophets in a more prosaic way, old prophets, which, I don't know, in my mind conjures individuals who lived probably a long time ago, perhaps with beards, saying things which are a bit indecipherable now, old prophets. But if you use the poetic inflection and, for example, said prophets old, then suddenly there's a sense that there's a vitality there which might actually have something to say to me now, because it's not that the prophets are lost in time, but there might speak timeless wisdom, prophets old. So you sort of want to hear that. And so that, Barfield would argue, is a little example of how a poetic inflection can release a whole new sense of meaning of the words, but at the same time make possible the perception of a whole new experience of reality as well. In
And
this
that is
case,
remarkable
yeah.
because I'm thinking here, who do I want to take advice from? Do I want to take advice from an old prophet or the prophet's old? There's something so magical about that that you can't although it would be tempting to boil it down to what we've received culturally or in media, whether that be print or film or otherwise. But obviously, there's something deeper there. And if we even had received it in a way, that had to have begun from some other reason. And so, how far back does Barfield go on this? How far can you even trace the roots of language to get at what it's actually trying to share and communicate?
Well, we have about 3,000 years of written language, in clay and stone at first, and then papyrus and parchment, and of course now print and so on. And so that gives us quite a good stretch, because we're talking there, back into the Egyptian period, in around the Mediterranean, deep into the Indus traditions in the Indian subcontinent, and elsewhere now too. And what that gives us, Barfield said, is a kind of fossil record in words of these shifts of consciousness. He said words, when they're old words reaching back into time, become fossils of consciousness. And so by imaginatively working out, I mean, to say a word like theory, I mentioned earlier in relation to Plato, a word that Plato uses very often, but when you look at the word and how it carried a different resonance 2,500 years ago, theory still very actively conveyed the sense of a kind of pilgrimage. A theoria was actually a journey you undertook to reach a
Mm.
kind of horizon that would release a different experience of things. And so Plato, when he's writing his dialogues, is not trying to reach theories as we would mean it now, kind of objective statements about the nature of things that we then put to the test. Now, his dialogues have this quality of the characters undergoing a kind of journey, not to necessarily even arrive at a fixed point, but that on the way their consciousness might expand. And when you realize that, and then you return to Plato's dialogues, rather than treating them as kind of exercises in analytical philosophy, but rather as imaginative unpackings of what might be going on, that they take on a completely different hue. So this word theory is both a word that we still use, but it's also a kind of fossil of an older consciousness that is really, I mean, I think it's essential actually to understand and unpack.
I think that's excellent. It's really fun. It's so amazing the types of connections you can draw between completely seemingly unrelated things. I always give the example of macchiato being tied back, you know, the type of coffee being tied back to the Virgin Mary. And there's you can go back long enough and get macchiate, maculare, all right, macula stain, the Immaculate Conception. There's ways of playing with these things, and you still see them living in the world in which we live. So a macchiato has this you know, most people obviously are not thinking of the Virgin Mary when they order a coffee, but it is a fossil that is still living among us. And so, in similar ways, it's almost these fossils that are preserved in the language and that evoke certain ideas, and that when you try to step into them and engage them on their own terms, so what perhaps they meant to people of old, then you're able to, again, with Aristotle, really go out and engage these texts in a totally different manner. And I think that's just phenomenal.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you said it's fun because I think it is fun. It is fascinating. It's kind of amazing because we use these words all day, every day, and a lot of the time, of course, don't even quite realize what we're invoking. But when you do pay attention to what you're invoking, it's mind expanding. I mean, just to relate a bit back to William Blake, and one of the things which I do in the book is think about the words that Blake was using, which were shifting in the Georgian period, or indeed were new in the Georgian period. So words like nihilism, that was a coinage of the time. And it's as if about that time, suddenly people started to realize that it might be possible to imagine that reality was a kind of void, that you didn't discover meaning, you had to somehow manufacture it yourself. And so the word nihilism captures that shift of consciousness.
Mm.
And it shows you, both how what it amplifies, I think, what this word might actually mean, but also it helps you to sort of, in a way, take an imaginative step onto the outside of the nihilistic mindset because it's got history and because our ancestors had a different way of relating to the world. So it becomes this mode of reflection on words, a way of traversing the difficulties of our own times as well. So it's sort of both an analysis and a remedy.
Well, you use the phrase taking an imaginative step. And I think that's a good launching off point into the concept of imagination itself as a gateway to truth. So again, from my understanding, it's such a shame that I've not spent as much time with Barfield as I'd like, but from my little understanding of him, he talks a little bit about just that, about imagination as a gateway to truth. So what can you tell us and share regarding that aspect of his writing?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's a really fundamental notion, and in a way, when you experience imagination in the almost infinitely rich way that he wants us to, you've already entered into a completely different world. But broadly speaking, he actually draws on a distinction which was made by Coleridge, another Georgian figure. And Coleridge makes actually a very well known distinction between what he calls imagination and fancy. So he's using the words just to demarcate a difference. But for Coleridge, fancy is a kind of play in which, you might be amused, you might be shocked, you might be startled, you might be entertained imaginatively. But fancy in itself doesn't really go anywhere. It kind of rises and falls a bit like a good joke. Whereas imagination is truth bearing. And so when you are encountering reality or others, when you're using a wider imagination and participating in it through your own imagination, reality starts to open up to you. And I mean, actually, it's not just Barfield and Coleridge that have been onto this, but there's a sort of romantic tradition in science, of which the best known example is Albert Einstein. But Einstein said too that imagination is given to us in order that we might receive from it intimations about the way that reality is. And he learned this because he has these very famous imaginative plays when he imagines riding on a light beam, like a child might, but it's the beginning of what becomes special relativity.
Mm.
And so that's the difference. It's not a fanciful um, imagination of Einstein in that case, because what it does is it opens up a theory in a modern sense that then hundreds, even thousands of people can work on. And, an artist, I don't know, a Van Gogh painting of the sunflowers. After you see that, you never quite look in sunflowers in the same way. So this is what imagination can do. It's almost like it mediates aspects of reality to us, some of which we already accept, and so it doesn't seem that imaginative. But the ones that make us sit up or take us by surprise or lead to a kind of amplification or development, that is when imagination is taking us out of ourselves into a wider world.
Well, to state the obvious here, imagination, this word that we're throwing out a lot, obviously comes from this root of image. And when I think of it that way, it's interesting because there's two routes you can go with that. The first is to take it as image being in some way what you see, and that what you see is the truth. You know, you see clearly in front of you, and to see clearly is to see the truth. But then there's the other sense of an image isn't necessarily the full truth because what you see may not be the truth. There are mirages, or maybe you see part of the story and not the full thing. And so, how do these two different senses of image play into that imagination? Is it something that, in some ways, as you said, it helps us see things from a different perspective? It can do so certainly in a helpful way, but also perhaps in a deceiving way as well. Would you have anything to say up to that?
No, for sure. And you're absolutely right. Of course. I mean, this is people's everyday experience. You can be wrong. But again, this would be contained in another reflection on this difference between fancy and imagination, because
Yeah.
imagination proper is also discerned. And so it brings in reason, it brings in testing. Because
Well,
the image,
I'm sorry to interrupt, but do elaborate on that point because I think most
yeah,
people wouldn't use imagination and reason in the same sentence together.
yeah. Well, look, so you might, I don't know, if you have a dream, the sort of staple of psychotherapy, and it just seems a bit crazy at first. You can't understand where those images have come from. So you spend time with the images and you might ask certain questions like, what's the associations or the resonance, or how does it relate to what I might have seen yesterday, or how do I feel in relation to those images? Do they feel just a bit sort of uninteresting and flat, in which case it might have just been your mind turning over? Or do they actually feel really quite energetic? So it's using reason, not in the sense of logic, although, occasionally that might come in, but more what's the rationale? What's the kind of the wisdom almost that might be coming through this image? And it's always been said actually that, images, we need to work at them and receive them actively, not just passively. Because if you're just sort of passive in relation to image making, it reduces yourself. Sometimes that's quite nice. You go to the cinema, you're in a dark room, everything is done for you. So you just have to sit and lap it up, and it's very relaxing. But when imagination is used in this fuller sense, you have to be active in relation to it, and bring all that you have to what is the image in front of you. Again, the artist knows this, the poet knows this. They get an intimation of something, and then they have to work at it to draw it out. And so, similarly, we can do the same with just everyday imagination as well.
Well, I think the image, to use that word once more, of the cinema is an apt one because indeed, when you watch a movie, you have the images just shown before you and you don't have to do any work. Whereas if you read, you don't, I say you have to, but it's almost like you get the privilege of creating those worlds for yourself. If you were to go through and experience Lord of the Rings for the first time, for example, in the theater, then you would approach the text already having in your mind images that had been dictated to you by others. Whereas if you were to read it by yourself before you ever saw the movie, then you would be able to experience that for yourself and make it real. And I just have to think that that experience is more intimate as well.
Yeah, I mean, the comparison there, I think, is really apposite. It's why, as well, I don't know, cinemas, but maybe screens that leave you passive anyway. All the work, as it were, is done by someone else in the production of the image. It might amuse you, but it also leaves you feeling a bit empty if you're on it for too long. Whereas a conversation, I hope even like this, but certainly reading a book, it requires you to be engaging with what's being communicated. And so actually, whilst that is more like work, it also is expanding because your soul is being drawn out into the soul of the communication concerned. So that's absolutely right. People would feel very aware of this now. And conversely, if you lose the ability to do that imaginative work, if you stop reading books, then it's a bit like you have to get book fit again in order to be able to do it, which is something that people experience now too when they get too lost in their screens.
I suspect that's very much the case. To bring this back to Dante and how Dante can help with the imagination, what does Barfield have to say with this? What is the value of Dante specifically in regards to how he can help one's imagination?
So I think what Dante was able to do is take something that was a huge disaster in his life and not only turn it into a great work of literature, but a work of literature that can communicate to us. And he says, I'm writing for you, my reader, as well. He breaks the fourth wall many times and educate your imagination as a result, too. So, broadly speaking, the story, I think, of Dante is that around the year 1300, 1301, he finally falls foul of the civil wars going on the Italian peninsula at the time. And he's exiled from Florence for the rest of his life. He just can't return on pain of death. And at the time, he loses everything, his family, his wealth, but also his local language, because there wasn't national Italian at the time. Dante very much helped form Italian as a national language. There was more like the Florentine dialect. So when you went to Padua or when you went to Ravenna, people would speak significantly differently, and that was a disaster for a poet like Dante. So it's a terrible tragedy that also stirs up all sorts of hate and anger and rage and depression in him as well. But I think he must have had like glimpses of the divine. Sometimes people suffer a terrible shock, but that shock also, because it removes everything that they once had, means that they fall back on something that they didn't even know that they had or knew. And so I think Dante must have had glimpses of the transcendent, of the divine, and so on, paradise. But then his brilliance is that he can draw lines between the dots and then fill out what happened, and so eventually, produce this astonishing, inspired poem. That the more you get into it, the more it becomes harder to work out how on earth it was produced. It's one of these texts that every time you return to it, it just yields more and more and more. And so I think that it's one of the supreme examples in modern Western culture of what the imagination can achieve, linked to someone's actual story. Of course, Dante tells his story in the Divine Comedy. There's both Dante the pilgrim, as it's sometimes said, as well as Dante the poet present in the text. But even in that way, let alone what actually happens and the wisdom that's transmitted and the encounters and the beauty of the text itself, even how this thing was made is a source of inspiration because it's such a brilliant exemplar of the imagination.
Now, we began this by discussing a little bit, just briefly, you had alluded to the fact that Lewis and Barfield would have had their occasional disagreements over the comedy and over the interpretations of Dante. Would you be able to say, I know I'm putting you on the spot here, are there any things in particular that they, would have butt heads about that you can share with us?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, actually, because Lewis died in '63, and then Barfield actually lives until 1998, so he lives a lot
So
longer.
he got the
So,
last word.
yeah, and Barfield actually became better known after Lewis died because when Lewis had died, very famous, particularly in the US, Barfield would give talks about his friend, and
Mm.
so some of Barfield's ideas become known. But also means that we have lectures that Barfield gave on Lewis, and as Barfield became more confident in himself, if you like, he starts to talk about the differences between him and his second friend as well, and that they're on things like the relationship of the imagination to reality. So Lewis, who'd been an analytical philosopher, particularly before he became a Christian, he always felt that imagination and reason are on a kind of are a kind of duality. You need both, but you need to give both equal weight. Whereas Barfield said, no, the imagination is always the source; it's always prior, and that our rational capacities, to see patterns, to spot similarities, to discern, and so on, that's always going to be in the service of the imagination. That was one thing that they argued about,
Okay.
um, the priority of the imagination, if you like. Another one was the significance of history, because, I mean, still now, but certainly in the 20th century, there's a huge debate about the drivers of history. Was there a kind of inner unfolding that emerged through historical time, or was history really just the story of human reactions to the changes in material conditions? One thing after another. And Lewis, he wasn't completely a sort of dead approach to history. It's just one damn thing after another.
Hmm.
But nonetheless, he certainly didn't go the full historicist route, which Barfield did. Barfield felt that everything has a kind of inner dynamic, and it's not omnipotent. It doesn't shape everything. There's always things that go wrong. There's always limitations and constraints and so on. But he was much, much more inclined than Lewis to treat the arc of history as itself having significance. You can detect and discern part of what it is to be human through the arc of history, rather than just saying, this happened then and it was a bad idea, so we must learn from that.
Hmm. Excellent. Now, I know we are slowly creeping up on our time here, so I would just want to ask one or two other questions for you. The first would be, what have you personally taken away, not just from Dante, but specifically from Owen Barfield's interpretation of Dante, and how has that impacted you in your own life?
It's kind of a challenge in a way, or an invitation, which is, you can read about things like the imagination and you can sort of toy with different theoretical possibilities. But really, the question is, what do you know in yourself? How does your own life expand as a result? When you look at a tree, for example, do you see a biological organism that's sort of admirable in its own way? Or do you see a living being that has a kind of wisdom about life and about how to live, with which you can have some sort of communication? That's really where the exciting challenge of Barfield and Dante is for me. I mean, to be a bit more particular about Dante as well, the Divine Comedy came alive for me rather than just being something to study when I was in my own therapy, actually, and it was quite an involved, drawn out process, and I got rather stuck. But when I read the Divine Comedy with a group of other people, so with a good teacher, particularly at that time, I suddenly got a glimpse through the text of how suffering needn't be hellish, but can become transformative because of reading the Purgatory in particular. And it wasn't just the stories or the facts, if you like, that's in the Purgatory. The text itself, I felt like, just lit a little spark inside me that I could tender and foster, and use as a guide for me as well. So um, it was very, very personal, actually. This sense of not just these are things to talk about or be interested in or be entertained by and be distracted by. No, they really can change your life because they change your perception of life.
Well, I love to hear that. I think Purgatory in particular is certainly my favorite of the three canticles, and I believe it is one of the best places to start with Dante. And by to start, I mean, obviously don't skip over Inferno, but to really like sink your teeth into and spend some time with, because hell is great. You get to go through it, it's entertaining. But in Purgatory, there is a degree of this just resonates with you and it's very applicable to everyday. I hate to use the term self-improvement, but to use the most base term to describe that sort of thing. It really does have this transformative aspect of ascent to it. You are climbing a mountain, you are ascending to the divine, and there are certain things that you can do that will help you in that journey. And so to anyone listening, certainly I'm just backing up what you're saying here is go to Purgatory and spend some time with that. I love to hear that, how that's had an impact in your own life.
I mean, I really agree with that, because partly because people often feel they got to begin with the Inferno, and even in public discussions about the Divine Comedy, but they never really get any further. And I feel
Hmm.
that says something, that we somehow feel that we won't understand anything else like purgatory or paradise. That says a lot about our time. So starting with the purgatory, as you suggest, but it has a day and a night. There's a lot of things which are more familiar in purgatory. So it's a kind of world that is sort of recognizable, in the way that perhaps hell isn't. It's more like a horror movie. And then paradise, it's demanding in its own way, as well.
Indeed. And then I certainly want to hear before we go as well about your upcoming book on William Blake. So do tell us about that. What are you writing about here and what can people expect to get out of it? I'm certainly
Look,
more interested after this conversation. I really need to get a copy.
oh, great. Well, look, I'm pleased about that, of course. Thank you. No, but again, I think that Blake is another one of these prophets of our times, by which I mean that he understands the inner dynamics. I mean, Blake himself says that what now is was once imagined. And that is a very important thing because rather than just leaving us sort of firefighting or dealing with symptoms, when you understand the inner life of what is now happening, you get to the roots and then you get to what's around the roots. And then you get to a wider perception that's not just constrained by what's happening now. And Blake is absolutely, I think, the person for our times. He lives a couple of hundred years ago at the beginning of what was the Industrial Revolution, the beginning of what's now called the modern period. Words like nihilism and so on emerging. But because he's at the beginning, it's before the overwhelm, which it's so easy to feel now. And so he can take us to the heart of our times. And that's very much what I'm trying to unpack in the root to make in the book. To make, Blake a friend, who again, a bit like Dante, a bit like Barfield, can give you more and more. And of course, Blake is so wonderful because his imagery, his phraseology, to see a world in a grain of sand, is so immediate at one level. But that's just the taster. That's just the start of it. And I feel that Blake. I live in South London, so he's kind of my local mystic.
Hmm.
But I do feel that he's got something absolutely tremendous, actually hopeful to say, even in what can seem like dark times.
Excellent. So who are you writing this book for? I mean, who needs to hear that message is what I'm getting at.
It's for the general reader, so it's someone maybe has and they've heard of Blake. I sort of sense there's something there, but I wonder what it is. There's a lot of Blake's imagery and poetry in the book too, so the idea is by the end of it, you're able to go to Blake's work yourself, and it feels that bit more familiar. So there's been a kind of a door has opened, even if just the jar that you can enter through. Yeah, so it's a general introduction, but I'm also trying to say to those who are more immersed in Blake, look, I think there's things that have been forgotten about Blake. In particular, I think he had a very, very sharp mind. He was engaged with the great intellects of the time, and he was one too. I think we've got to take his visionary abilities seriously, his clairvoyance. He says that he saw angels and so on. So rather than just diagnosing that, how can we stay with that and see where it might lead us? Not in a naive way, in this complex, imaginative, discerning kind of way.
Mm.
But then there's also the mystical side. I think that, Blake's often read as a great political commentator, as a great creative, of course, but he was a visionary, he was a mystic. And so that interiority again, that sacred interiority, that divine aspect of life, I think Blake's one of the most important figures in that since the Reformation.
Well, thank you. And do tell people where they can get that. And then I just have one last question for you here.
Thanks again. Yeah, so I have a website, markvernon.com. I'm on Substack too. I use social media fairly regularly. But yeah, markvernon.com is one go-to place.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you for that. My closing question for you would be for anyone interested in what we've discussed about this imagination, evolution of consciousness, the world being this logos infused place where words have a real impact on both the material and the spiritual. Where would you recommend they start with this? Is it reading Barfield? Is it reading Dante? What would you say if someone wants to go further down that route of pursuing what we've discussed in this conversation? Where would you suggest, I should say, that they go to further pursue that?
I mean, Barfield, um, he gave a lot of talks, as I mentioned, partly in the US, and they have now been produced in book form. One's called Speaker's Meaning, one's called Guilt, History, Habit. There's a fairly new collection of his sort of shorter form works as well, his journalism, which is collected together in a book called The Riddle of the Sphinx. And those shorter pieces by Barfield are actually, I think, the best way into Barfield. He did write longer books like Poetic Diction about poetry. His sort of final book, which has the full extent of his big theory on the evolution of consciousness, is called Saving the Appearances. And then there's a lot, that there are increasingly materials available online. I mean, people like myself I've written a sort of introduction to Barfield through the Christian lens. And so reading a bit of the original alongside a more accessible introduction is always a good way to do it, I think. Don't just rely on the introduction, helpful though that can be, and writer of them though I am, but always try and turn to the original writer, because then you get the spirit, you get the feel of it as well, and that's going to be as important as just the communication of the insight.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Mark, so much for your time. This has really been a pleasure. And to anyone listening, obviously, do go check out his website, check out his book, his writings. Thank you so much. It's really been a pleasure, and I have indeed learned a lot in this conversation.
Yeah, well, thanks to you, because I think, what you guys are doing, these kind of conversations, hopefully people can feel the energy, feel the buzz, even as we're speaking, even as, more material by you guys is produced. I think that's so important as well.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and